That's the pattern, folks. Anytime anything having to do with Africa is mentioned, they absolutely must put a white person in there. And failing that, they simply don't mention it at all. They pretend as if it never happened. This is a mass mental disorder of vast proportions. In his most famous work, The Odyssey, Homer described the Ethiopians as favorites of the gods and the most just of men. As I said in part 2 of this series, modern Eurocentrics claim the location of Ethiopia was in and around modern-day Palestine. But as David Sachs writes in a dictionary of the ancient Greek world, neither Homer nor any of the other early Greek writers gave Ethiopia any sort of location. And when the Greeks did finally begin to write of where Ethiopia was, they placed it in Nubia, not Western Asia. Furthermore, Herodotus wrote the Ethiopians were the most beautiful and longest lived of the human races. Imagine that! The first time black is beautiful is expressed in recorded history, it was done by the Greeks. But hey, who are we going to believe? The ancient Greeks or the Euro clowns? Now that we've made clear the connection between Africa and Greece, let's see if we can find any connection between Greece and the Euro clowns. The Greeks had literature, philosophy, organized religion, and science thousands of years ago. In fact, Greece was where the first writing of the white world came from, starting with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, where he frequently mentions Ethiopia, but gives no mention to the lands north of him. Let's look at the Northern Europeans. What were their ancient writing systems? Oh, that's right. The Northern Europeans didn't have any writing systems. Well, let's look at their architecture then. Oh, I forgot. They didn't have any architecture either, though they did have this, a pile of rocks. And they don't even know what purpose this rock pile served. Some white people say it was an ancient astronomy lab, though they still can't tell you what it was these ancient whites were allegedly looking at. Other whites say it was a meeting place for druids. Others still say it was a landing spot for UFOs. Perhaps the reason the Northern Europeans are so confused about their history is because until recently, they largely didn't have one. We'll take Britain as an example. Literacy of any kind didn't come to the English people until the Romans invaded in 41 AD, but even then it wasn't the Brits doing any writing, it was the Romans, such as the Roman historian Tacitus, who reveals that the British were naked savages. To further show their disdain for the British, the Romans referred to them as Britunculi, little Britons, like calling them children. The historian Strabo described the British as war-mad and always ready for battle. Tacitus gave an account of the British ritual of human sacrifice, saying they deemed it indeed a duty to cover their altars with the blood of captives and to consult their deities through human entrails. Fighting naked, barbaric customs? Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? The Roman attempts to domesticate the English predictably ended in failure. And about 410 AD the Romans left, but even after 4 centuries of study, the English had utterly failed to educate themselves, because it would still be another 2 centuries before the Saxons, Germanic immigrants from Europe who would come to Britain and manage to teach the English to write. Imagine that! There have been people in Britain for over 12,000 years, but they didn't learn how to translate their grunts into written symbols until about 650 AD. And had it not been for the Romans, who the Saxons learned Latin from, the English would still be sitting in their caves grunting like animals and totally unable to write. They didn't have a writing system, and they weren't on the verge of making one. And for that matter, neither were the Saxons, the Russians, or any other group of Northern Europeans. The Romans literally had to come and show these people how to wear clothes and how to write their names. So, how can they claim a connection to Greece when their first contact with the outside world came with the Romans? When you have no history, you have to make one up. Now we see why they are so desperate to attach themselves to Greece. It's either that or admit that every other group of people on Earth had managed to create writing systems and architecture and forms of government and civilization except them. Now, it's a subject that deserves many books but so far hasn't received even one, and that is that the Northern Europeans are essentially an AD people. Before Rome, these people might as well not even have existed. But to add insult to injury, the same Northern Europeans who want to claim Greece as part of their heritage didn't even consider Greeks to be white people until the 20th century. Why? Because Greeks are darker than Northern Europeans, and given their glaring proximity to Africa and their innumerable mentions of Ethiopians in their history and mythology, it was clear the Greeks had black ancestry, and science has discovered this as well. The Northern Europeans resented having been totally left out of the grand Greek story, so they decided that once they'd taken over the world, they would treat the Greeks as outcasts, until it was convenient for them to change their minds. As black scholars go about reclaiming our heritage in Egypt, expect to see more movies, TV shows, and documentaries about Rome and Greece. The Euro clowns have lost this battle, and they know it, so they're retreating to safer ground. But if they're planning to make their last stand in Greece, they might want to think twice. Because there's a reason the Greeks never called themselves Europeans, and why they showed such profound respect for the Ethiopians and the Egyptians, and why Homer and Herodotus credited so much of their civilization to Africa. Oh yes, black truth hurts. So in summation, let's make it clear to the Euro clowns what Africa contributed to the world and what the Europeans did. Ours, yours. Ours, yours. Ours, yours. Any questions?